Magyarok határon innen és túl. Ma itt vannak velünk a lengyelek.
What if the fate of millions was determined by the greed and egos of the world's most powerful leaders? A battle is raging behind closed doors, one that could reshape Europe forever. As billions of dollars are at stake and lives hang in the balance, key figures like Trump, Orban, and Merz play their dangerous games. The truth? Europe may be on the brink of collapse, and the war in Ukraine might be just the beginning. This isn't just politics. This is the future of nations at risk. Stay with us for the truth that will shake you to your core.
The next steps ahead are the more complicated ones now. The path is open. You opened it last Friday.
In recent years, Friedrich Merz has found himself at the center of a significant political and financial struggle. He's made several attempts to secure billions of dollars from the United States to help finance Ukraine's ongoing conflict. However, things aren't going quite as planned. Despite his efforts, former President Donald Trump has grown increasingly frustrated with the situation, and he's not alone. Amidst this tension, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, has emerged as a key player, aligning himself with Trump in opposition to Brussels. Together, they have challenged the European Union, and their combined influence has cast doubt on the future of Ukraine's financial support. For Friedrich Merz, this has become a defining moment in his political career. Once seen as a potential leader for Germany, his vision for Ukraine's war chest and his calls for financial assistance from the US seem to be faltering. It's a situation that highlights the complex intersection of European politics, international diplomacy, and financial strategy. At the heart of this struggle is the ongoing war in Ukraine and the role that Europe and the United States will play in its resolution. While millions around the world hope for an end to the conflict, the reality is much more complicated. An internal report leaked by Axios sheds light on the current situation, revealing that the European Union has been actively preventing peace in Ukraine. Rather than seeking a diplomatic resolution, Brussels is accused of putting pressure on Kiev with unrealistic demands. This has led to growing frustration within the United States, especially within Trump's circle. According to his advisors, the EU's actions are preventing any meaningful progress toward peace, and they believe that Europe's stance is prolonging the conflict. The political dynamics have become even more complex as Trump has increasingly criticized the EU for its role in the conflict. He points out that America has been shouldering the majority of the financial burden. While the EU hesitates and delays action, Trump's frustration with Brussels has reached a boiling point, and he is now demanding that Europe contribute more. But this has raised a significant issue. Europe is already struggling with its own financial limitations. European taxpayers are already stretched thin by budgets that are increasingly focused on internal defense and economic stability. Many in Europe are reluctant to continue funding the war effort, especially when faced with mounting pressures at home. In response, Friedrich Merz, who has been designated as Germany's next chancellor, has attempted to find a solution. He has set his sights on securing a massive financial package for Ukraine, aiming to raise up to $300 billion. His plan centers around creating a reparations loan, backed by Russia's frozen assets. This loan would be used to finance Ukraine's war effort and ensure the country's sovereignty in the face of Russian aggression. Merz's plan is to create a financial cushion for Ukraine that will allow it to continue the fight, potentially forcing Russia to come to the negotiating table. The idea is that by securing this loan, Ukraine would be able to withstand the pressures of the war, especially the financial burden it faces in terms of weapons and other military support. However, the reality is that such a plan faces significant obstacles. Trump, who has been vocal about his opposition to further U.S. financial aid to Ukraine, is unlikely to support a plan that would involve the U.S. contributing even more resources to the effort. Instead, Trump has suggested that Europe should take on a larger share of the financial responsibility. The issue for Merz is that Europe simply doesn't have the capacity to fund such an effort on its own. European nations are already facing financial strain, with governments prioritizing internal defense and social welfare programs. Many European citizens are growing increasingly disillusioned with the ongoing support for Ukraine, especially when they are facing their own economic challenges. As a result, any attempts to secure more funding from Europe face significant resistance. In an attempt to sway Trump, Merz flew to Washington, hoping to make a personal appeal to the former president. He believed that if he could convince Trump to support his plan, he might be able to secure the necessary funds to help Ukraine. Merz's vision was to create a loan that would be secured by Ukrainian claims on war reparations from Russia. In the event that Russia refuses to pay, which seems likely, the frozen Russian assets could be seized to repay the loan. Merz hoped that this plan would not only provide financial support for Ukraine, but also send a strong message to Russia. He believed that by taking a firm stance on the issue, Trump could demonstrate his commitment to applying pressure on Russia in order to bring about a ceasefire. This would show that the United States is still engaged in the effort to resolve the conflict, even if the financial burden was being shifted more onto Europe. However, this idea has faced strong resistance from political experts who have questioned the feasibility of such a plan. Trump, they argue, is unlikely to finance any more initiatives, especially when there is no clear end to the conflict in sight. A senior U.S. official has made it clear that if Europe wants to escalate the situation and drain its own citizens for funds, that is their decision. But if Europe chooses that path, then Europe should be the one to bear the financial burden. The reality is that the U.S. has already contributed a significant amount of financial aid to Ukraine, and many in Washington are tired of seeing their taxpayer dollars go toward an endless conflict. According to Trump, Europe must step up and contribute more, but Brussels is reluctant to take on the responsibility. Instead, the EU continues to delay and block any meaningful action, leaving the US frustrated and questioning Europe's commitment to resolving the conflict. In the midst of all this, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, has emerged as a major player on the European stage. Orban has been vocal in his opposition to the EU's handling of the Ukraine conflict, and he has found a powerful ally in Trump. The two leaders have met behind closed doors, discussing economic and political strategies that challenge the current European order. Orban's vision is one of sovereign national states, rather than a centralized bureaucratic Europe, and he is willing to take bold steps to make that vision a reality. Orban's opposition to Brussels has become more pronounced in recent months. He has taken steps to distance Hungary from key EU institutions, including blocking funds for weapons deliveries to Ukraine. Orban's moves have been supported by Trump, who sees Hungary as a key ally in reshaping the European landscape. But Orban's stance is not without consequences. It has triggered a wave of political and diplomatic fallout across Europe, with many nations questioning Hungary's commitment to the EU. As Orban continues to challenge Brussels, his political influence has only grown. He has been joined by other right-wing leaders, including Marine Le Pen in France, Matteo Salvini in Italy, and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. These leaders are rallying behind Orban's vision of a Europe that prioritizes national sovereignty over EU centralization. Together, they represent a growing force that threatens the very foundations of the EU. As the conflict in Ukraine continues, the financial strain on both Europe and the United States becomes more apparent. For many, the cost of the war is reaching unsustainable levels, and the political ramifications of continued support are beginning to show. Trump's position is clear. He will no longer finance the conflict, and Europe must take on more of the burden. But even as Europe's financial struggles deepen, the situation in Ukraine becomes increasingly dire. The proposed loan from Friedrich Merz, aimed at securing up to $300 billion for Ukraine, is seen by many as a last-ditch effort to sustain the war. The plan is based on the idea of using frozen Russian assets as collateral for the loan, with the goal of ensuring Ukraine can continue fighting despite limited external support. However, as the war drags on, the likelihood of a quick resolution grows slimmer, and the political tension surrounding the financial aid only intensifies. The European Union is struggling with its own internal contradictions. On one hand, European leaders are publicly committed to supporting Ukraine. On the other hand, the political and financial realities of such support are increasingly hard to ignore. Europe, already burdened with its own defense and economic challenges, is not willing to contribute the vast sums needed to sustain Ukraine's war effort. The pressure on European taxpayers is growing, and many are questioning whether the financial support for Ukraine is worth the cost. Merz's plan to secure a loan for Ukraine, backed by the potential reparations from Russia, offers a possible solution. But the reality is that this plan faces immense opposition both within Europe and in the United States. Trump's unwillingness to approve more financial aid for Ukraine signals a major shift in U.S. policy. While he had previously supported Ukraine, the strain of the war and the pressure from American taxpayers have led him to take a more isolationist stance. The message is clear: the United States will not continue to fund the war indefinitely. As Trump and his advisors express frustration with the EU, they are also growing increasingly impatient with Europe's reluctance to act. The White House has been vocal in its criticism, accusing Europe of dragging its feet, while America takes on the majority of the financial burden. Trump's frustration is palpable, and his demands are growing more severe. He wants Europe to step up, but European leaders are hesitant, aware that any further escalation could have serious consequences for their own economies and political stability. The EU's internal divisions are becoming more pronounced as well. While some European leaders continue to push for stronger support for Ukraine, others are starting to question the wisdom of such a strategy. Many European citizens are growing increasingly disillusioned with the conflict, and political leaders are feeling the pressure from their constituents. As the war drags on, public opinion is shifting, and the political cost of supporting Ukraine is beginning to outweigh the perceived benefits. In this environment, Viktor Orban's role becomes even more significant. Orban has long been a vocal critic of the EU's handling of the Ukraine crisis, and his alliance with Trump is seen as a direct challenge to Brussels. Orban's vision for Europe is fundamentally at odds with the EU's current direction, and his actions are increasingly being viewed as a rejection of the European project as a whole. Orban has made it clear that he sees the EU's centralizing tendencies as a threat to national sovereignty, and he is willing to take bold steps to counter that threat. Orban's decision to withdraw Hungary from key EU institutions and block funds for Ukraine's war effort is a direct challenge to Brussels' authority. His actions have been supported by Trump, who sees Orban as a key ally in his efforts to reshape Europe's political landscape. Trump and Orban's alliance is more than just a political partnership. It represents a broader shift in the balance of power in Europe. For Orban, aligning with Trump is a way to push back against the EU's centralizing agenda and to promote a vision of Europe based on national sovereignty. Orban's actions have had significant political ramifications, not just in Hungary, but across Europe. His criticism of the EU has found support from other right-wing leaders, including Marine Le Pen in France, Matteo Salvini in Italy, and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. Together, these leaders represent a growing movement that is challenging the EU's authority and its vision for Europe's future. They are advocating for a Europe that prioritizes national interests over EU centralization, and they are increasingly gaining traction among European voters. This growing alliance of nationalist and right-wing leaders is seen as a direct threat to the EU's future. Orban's vision of a Europe of sovereign nation-states, rather than a centralized bureaucratic structure, is gaining support among many Europeans who feel alienated by the EU's policies. As the political dynamics in Europe shift, the influence of figures like Orban, Le Pen, Salvini, and Wilders continues to grow. These leaders are not just protesting EU policies, they are actively working to reshape the future of Europe. Orban's moves have triggered alarm within Brussels, and the EU is facing increasing pressure to respond. The rise of nationalist and populist movements within the EU has already led to significant political instability, and the situation is unlikely to improve as these movements continue to gain momentum. The EU is increasingly divided, with member states struggling to agree on key issues, including the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The political and economic landscape in Europe is rapidly changing, and the EU's traditional structure is under threat. The growing influence of right-wing leaders and the increasing opposition to EU centralization are reshaping the political map of Europe. As Orban and other nationalist leaders continue to challenge the EU, they are pushing Europe toward a new political reality, one where national sovereignty takes precedence over EU institutions. In Germany, the political fallout from the EU's handling of the Ukraine crisis is also becoming evident. Friedrich Merz, the newly appointed chancellor, is finding himself at the center of a growing political storm. While he has attempted to steer Germany's course within the EU, he faces mounting opposition from both within his own party and from the right-wing populist AfD. The pressure on Merz is intensifying as more Germans express dissatisfaction with the EU's handling of the crisis. The AfD has seized on the growing disillusionment with the EU, using it to fuel its rise in the polls. The party has positioned itself as the primary opposition to the EU's centralizing policies, advocating for greater national sovereignty and a re-evaluation of Germany's role within the European project. As the AfD gains support, the political landscape in Germany is shifting, and the country's traditional support for the EU is being called into question. The growing influence of the AfD, along with the rise of nationalist movements across Europe, is putting increasing pressure on the EU. As the political and economic divide between European nations deepens, the future of the EU becomes increasingly uncertain. The European Union, once seen as a symbol of stability and unity, is now facing a series of existential challenges.